The homeowners association put 12 commercial buildings on my land, and honestly, they thought they'd finally buried the stubborn old man under enough concrete to make me disappear forever. But they forgot one thing about engineers. We don't just get mad, we calculate. They tore down my fences, they bulldozed a memorial I'd spent months building for my late wife, and they laughed when I showed them my deed, calling me a bitter relic clinging to dirt. So I decided to let them finish every single floor, every roof, and every parking space while I sat on my porch with a glass of bourbon and a blueprint they never saw coming. Stick around, because you're about to see exactly why you should never build an empire on a foundation of lies. And if you think no one should have their life's work stolen by a bunch of power-tripping bureaucrats, hit that subscribe button right now, because we're tearing this whole thing down. It all started on a Tuesday morning in late September, the kind of morning where the air is crisp and the mist is still hanging low over the creek that runs through the back of my property. And I was just standing there in the kitchen, waiting for the coffee to drip, when I heard it, that deep, rhythmic, metallic thumping that makes your teeth rattle. I looked out the window, and my heart just dropped because there was this massive, yellow excavator, looking like some prehistoric beast, and its hydraulic arm was swinging with this casual, violent grace as it systematically smashed through the cedar rail fence my father and I had built back in the 70s. Every post that snapped sounded like a bone breaking, and standing right there beside the machine was this kid, maybe 25 years old, wearing a crisp white polo with the Silver Oaks Community Association logo, and holding a tablet like it was a scepter of power. I didn't oppose. To even put on shoes, I just marched out there in my socks, feeling the cold dew and the sharp gravel, and I yelled over the engine, asking what the hell they thought they were doing on private property. And this kid, his name was Brandon, I'd seen him around the clubhouse acting like he owned the sidewalks. He just looked at me with this pitying, smug little smile and didn't oppose to even look up from his screen. He told me that the board had, realigned the community boundaries, for the new commercial expansion, and that my 5 acres had been annexed under a, neighborhood improvement clause, which is just a fancy way of saying they wanted my land and decided to take it. I told him he was trespassing, that I had the original deed signed by the county back in Oppos, 68, and he just laughed a dry, hollow sound and told me that, the future doesn't Oppos. Wait for old paperwork, Mr. Vance, before signaling the driver to keep going. That's when it got bad, because as I was standing there, the excavator turned toward the clearing by the creek, the place where my wife, Martha, used to sit for hours just watching the dragonflies. After she passed 3 years ago, I'd spent the whole summer building this stone and oak bench right there, a quiet place where her ashes were scattered, and it was the only thing I'd left that felt like she was still with me. I tried to run, tried to get in front of the machine, but Brandon grabbed my arm, telling me to stay back for, safety reasons, and I had to watch as that heavy steel bucket came down and crushed the oak, ground the stones into the mud, and turned the most sacred place in my life into a raw, red scar in the earth. He called it, clearing debris, and in that moment, something in me didn't oppose. Just break. It hardened into something cold and precise, because I realized these people didn't oppose. just wanted the land. They wanted to erase the person who lived on it. I spent the next week at the county records office, sitting under those flickering fluorescent lights and smelling the old dust, because I'm a structural engineer by trade, and I know that everything in this world is built on a grid, and if the grid is wrong, the whole structure is a lie. I pulled the original plat maps, the ones drawn with ink and hand-signed, and then I pulled the new maps filed by the HOA board, and there was a forgery so blatant it was almost insulting, where someone had literally used a digital tool to slide the boundary lines over my parcel and then fake the surveyor and Oppo's stamp. I took all of it to a lawyer in town, a guy I'd known since high school, and he just shook his head, telling me that while I was right, the HOA had a legal team on retainer and a multi-million-dollar development budget behind them, and they'd bury me in motions and appeals for a decade until I was dead or broke. He told me to, take a settlement and, to let them have the land and move on, but he didn't oppose. T understand that for an engineer, a problem this big doesn't oppose. T need a settlement, It needs a solution that hits the ground with the weight of 1,000 tons. So I went home, and I did something that confused everyone. I stopped fighting. I let the grass grow long. I sat on my porch and watched the concrete trucks roll in at 6 a.m., and I watched as they poured the foundations for 12 sprawling, modern commercial units, right where Martha's Creek used to run. Brandon and the HOA president, a woman named Sheila who drove a white Mercedes and treated the neighborhood like her personal fiefdom, would drive by and wave with this patronizing and quote, "I in oppose. Am glad you in oppose." He accepted reality and quote. Look on their faces, and I just nod back, sipping my tea and checking my watch. What they didn't in oppose, Tino, was that every night after the crews went home, I was out there with my old Navy surveying gear and a man named Silas. The only surveyor in 3 counties who still knew how to find a true corner post buried under 3 feet of fill dirt. Silas and I spent those nights in the dark, using laser levels and GPS transponders, and we confirmed what I'd suspected from the very beginning. The HOA hadn't oppose. T just built a few buildings on the edge of my land. They had placed the entire, in quote, Evergreen Plaza, in quote, development, every single square inch of it, right in the middle of my deeded property, because they were too arrogant to think an old man would ever verify the math. They were building a $1 million monument to their own greed, and I was going to let them pay for every nail, every window, and every coat of paint, because the beauty of property law is that if you build a house on someone else in oppose, land without a valid easement, you didn't in oppose. T just built a house. You gave them a gift. The construction took 8 months, and it was a masterpiece of modern architecture, with glass storefronts, a boutique gym, a high-end coffee shop, and a real estate office for Sheila herself right in the center, and I watched them host the, in quote, grand opening gala, in quote, with champagne and a string quartet. I was there too, standing on the edge of the crowd in my old work jacket, and Sheila actually walked up to me, smelling like expensive perfume and victory, and told me that, in quote, now the neighborhood finally has some class, Don and oppose. Do you think? End quote. And I just smiled and told her, in quote, it certainly is a solid piece of work, Sheila. I hope it lasts, end quote. She didn't oppose. T, get the joke? Not until 3 days later when the certified letters arrived. Not from me, but from the most aggressive litigation firm in the state, a group of, end quote, sharks in suits, end quote. I'd hired using a second mortgage on my house because when you're going for the throat, you don and oppose. T, use a pocket knife. The letter was A, end quote. Notice of ownership and immediate vacancy, end quote. And it didn't in oppose. T, just go to the HOA. It went to the bank that financed the project, the insurance companies, and every single tenant who had just signed a 5-year lease. The panic was instantaneous, like a dam breaking, because suddenly the, in quote, Evergreen Plaza, end quote, wasn't oppose. T, a commercial success. It was a massive legal liability sitting on stolen land with a forged deed as its only defense. We met in a boardroom that felt like a funeral, and Sheila was there, her face the color of ash, and her lawyers were trying to bluster about, in quote, clerical errors, in quote, and, in quote, good faith development, in quote. But then I stood up and laid out the acetate overlays I'd made, showing the 1968 deed perfectly matching the current topography and the HOA and oppose. S map looking like a child in oppose. S drawing. I told them they had 48 hours to make a choice. They could either pay me the full market value of the buildings plus triple damages for the destruction of my wife's memorial and the emotional distress of the last year, or I would exercise my right as the landowner to have the sheriff come out and chain the doors to every single business on that lot. The bank's lawyer looked like he was going to throw up because he realized that if they fought me and lost, they'd lose the entire investment and the land, and my lawyer just sat there, tapping his pen, waiting for the sound of the white flag hitting the floor. It wasn't oppose. T, just about the money, though that was a nice way to pay off my house and Martha and oppose. S, medical bills, it was about the moment I walked back onto that land with a crew of my own. I didn't in oppose. T, want the buildings really, so I sold the structures back to the tenants for a symbolic dollar and forced the HOA to sign a perpetual, ironclad easement that gave me full control over the creek and the woods forever, with a clause that says if they ever set foot on my grass again, I own their clubhouse too. I took a portion of the settlement and rebuilt that clearing, not just with one bench, but with a stone garden and a small bridge And I made sure the HOA had to pay for a security guard to watch it 24 hours a day, so nothing ever happens to it again. Now, I sit on that new bench every evening, and sometimes I see Sheila or Brandon driving by, looking at the plaza that they built but can never truly control, and they want an oppos to even make eye contact with me because they know that the old man in the socks wasn't an oppos. T just clinging to dirt. He was guarding a legacy. The neighborhood is different now. People actually stop by my porch to ask for advice on their own HOA disputes. And I just tell them to keep their deeds close and their math closer, because power is just a structure, and every structure has a pressure point if you know where to look. But it makes me wonder, did I go too far by letting them spend all that money just to snatch it away at the last second? Or is it the only way to teach people that some things aren't an oppos? T for sale? Let me know in the comments if you've ever had an HOA try to pull a fast one on you, or if you think I should have just taken the first settlement and kept the peace. I'll be reading every single one. So Don and oppos. T hold back, and I and oppos. LL, see you in the next one.